Somewhere in a museum display case, there is a reconstruction of a Neanderthal. Hunched shoulders, heavy brow, slack jaw, dragging a club, standing next to a sleek, upright Homo sapiens who looks like he's about to invent the iPhone. This image has been burned into textbooks, natural history dioramas, and popular imagination for over 100 years. It is also, almost entirely, wrong. We told ourselves a story about Neanderthals. We needed them to be dumb so that we could feel smart. We needed them to be brutes so that we could be the heroes of our own origin story. The clever newcomers who swept in from Africa and outcompeted a lesser species into extinction through sheer cognitive superiority. It was a clean story. It made us feel good. And it was wrong in almost every detail. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia for roughly 400,000 years. Let that land for a moment. 400,000 years. Our entire recorded human civilization, every empire, every language, every book, every war, every city, fits inside about 5,000 years. Neanderthals were doing whatever Neanderthals did for 80 times longer than all of that. A species that survives ice ages, hunts megafauna, and persists across an entire continent for nearly 500,000 years is not a failed experiment. It is a staggering success. And the more we dig into the evidence, the more that success looks like something uncomfortably close to us. This is not a story about how Neanderthals were secretly us. They weren't. They were different. Their brains were shaped differently. Their social groups were probably smaller. Their cultural output was sparser than ours. But different is not the same as stupid, and for too long, we confused the two. The story of Neanderthals is the story of what we erased when we needed a lesser version of ourselves to look down on. And it's the story of what we took from them, literally, molecularly, written into the DNA of almost every person alive on Earth today. Let's start with the glue. 200,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now Europe, a Neanderthal sat next to a fire and made something that should not have been possible for a creature we insisted was barely smarter than a chimpanzee. They made glue, not accidentally, not by stumbling over a sticky substance and deciding to use it. They made it deliberately, through a process that requires multiple steps, sustained attention, an understanding of how heat transforms materials, and the foresight to produce something you cannot use immediately. A substance that only becomes useful after it cools, after it sets, after time has passed, and you apply it to a tool you are building for a task you are planning. Birch bark tar, the Neanderthal glue, is made by heating birch bark in a controlled, low-oxygen environment. The most efficient methods involve burying bark in a pit, building a fire above it, and waiting. Get the oxygen level wrong and you burn the bark. Get the temperature wrong and you get nothing. The process requires, as researchers from Leiden University who recreated it from scratch discovered, a real working understanding of fire management. Not just starting a fire, but controlling one precisely enough to drive a specific chemical reaction at a specific temperature. Then, once you have your tar, you mix it with ochre, the reddish iron mineral found at Neanderthal sites across Europe, and the mixture becomes a compound adhesive, stronger, more rigid, more durable than either substance alone. Researchers at New York University who identified this compound adhesive at Le Moustier in France called it the earliest evidence of a complex adhesive ever found in Europe. What they were describing is a Neanderthal who understood material science. They used this glue to haft stone tools, to bind carefully shaped flint blades to wooden handles, creating composite weapons. A flint point tied to a shaft is not just a rock. It is a force multiplier. It extends reach, concentrates impact, turns a heavy stone into something light and devastating. The engineering behind it is not trivial. It requires the maker to think about the tool not as a single object but as a system. Handle plus adhesive plus blade. each part serving the whole, none of them useful on their own. A mind that builds systems is not a simple mind, and that is just the glue. There was also the rope. In a cave in France called Abri du Marat, archaeologists found a small fragment of twisted cord attached to a stone tool. It was about 6 millimeters long, barely the width of a pencil, and roughly 50,000 years old. Under a microscope, it revealed 3 separate bundles of plant fibers, each twisted in one direction. Then all 3 twisted together in the opposite direction. A 3-ply cord, made using exactly the technique that rope makers still use today. The researchers who published this finding in 2020 were careful about their language, the way scientists always are. But they also said something worth sitting with. Making twisted cord requires understanding pairs, sets, and numbers. It requires holding in your mind a pattern that is counterintuitive. Twist right, then combine left, and executing it consistently across multiple strands simultaneously. They wrote that this implies, alongside the birch tar and the art and the shell beads, that the idea of Neanderthals as cognitively inferior to modern humans is becoming increasingly untenable. That is the scientific version of saying, we were wrong. Rope is not just rope. Rope is the thing that enables bags, nets, clothing, hafted tools, shelters, traps, and boats. Rope is an entire technology platform. If Neanderthals were making rope 50,000 years ago, they were not the improvising hand-to-mouth opportunists we pictured. They were planning, storing, building, and maintaining. They had, in the truest sense, infrastructure. In a cave in Spain, there are red-painted shapes on the walls. Dots, hand stencils, geometric lines. Some of them have been dated to more than 65,000 years ago, which is approximately 20,000 years before modern humans arrived in Europe. Whoever made those marks was in Europe before we were. Whoever made them was almost certainly Neanderthal. The debate over Neanderthal art has been fierce, and it is worth being honest about where it stands. Some researchers push back on the dating methods. Some argue that making marks is not the same as making art in any meaningful symbolic sense. The science is genuinely contested, and that's worth saying. But even setting aside the cave paintings, the evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior piles up from other directions. Shell beads, deliberately pierced and colored with pigment, found at multiple European sites predating modern human arrival. Ochre crayons, iron-rich mineral pieces shaped into points and worn down through repeated use, found at sites in Crimea going back 70,000 years. Eagle talons, carefully cut from eagle feet and drilled for stringing, found at a Croatian site 130,000 years old. These are objects that serve no survival function. They are not weapons, not tools, not food. The only reason to make them is meaning, to communicate identity, status, beauty, or belief across people and time. A species making jewelry is a species with a self. A species with a self is not a brute. None of this technology existed in a vacuum. It was built in service of staying alive in one of the most demanding environments any human species has ever occupied. Neanderthals lived through multiple glacial cycles, periods when Europe was not the mild, forested continent it is today, but a vast, cold steppe where winter lasted half the year, and the animals large enough to sustain a group of humans were also large enough to kill one without much effort. Woolly mammoths, cave bears, wild aurochs, bison. Neanderthal skeletons tell the story of how they hunted these animals, and it is not a comfortable story. Their bones show a pattern of injuries, healed fractures clustered on the upper body, the head, the shoulders, that mirrors almost exactly the injury pattern found in rodeo riders. People who get very close to very large, very dangerous animals, and occasionally get hit. Neanderthals were ambush hunters. They got close. They used thrusting spears rather than throwing them from a distance, which means they were routinely within arm's reach of prey that weighed 10 times what they did. This was not the behavior of an animal acting on instinct. It required planning, coordination, assigned roles, and the ability to communicate a complex strategy to a group and execute it together, under pressure, at close range, with something enormous trying to kill you. The social structure behind all of this was something we consistently underestimated, because the groups were small. Neanderthal bands were probably somewhere between 10 and 30 individuals, significantly smaller than typical modern human groups. Researchers have used this to argue that Neanderthals lacked the social networks to build complex cumulative culture. That knowledge died with individuals because there weren't enough people to maintain and transmit it reliably. This is probably partly true, but it is worth asking what it means to maintain culture in a group of 30 people who have known each other their entire lives, who share everything, who are collectively responsible for the survival of every member, and who have been passing down the knowledge of how to make fire and birch tar and rope for generation after generation for hundreds of thousands of years. That is not the absence of culture. It is culture at a different scale, running at a different speed, built for different conditions, and surviving them. In the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, inside a cave called Shanidar, archaeologists have spent decades uncovering the remains of Neanderthals who were deliberately placed in the ground. Not dragged aside, not abandoned. Placed. In specific positions, in specific parts of the cave, at a site that was returned to again and again across thousands of years. A Neanderthal found there, called Shanidar 1, had survived into middle age with one arm amputated, one eye likely blind, and serious damage to his lower body. He had survived these injuries, healed from them, and gone on living. In a group that hunted large animals at close range and had nothing resembling modern medicine, surviving that degree of injury means someone fed you, carried you, kept you warm. Someone decided your life was worth maintaining, even when you could no longer contribute to the hunt. The famous flower burial at Shanidar, the idea that Neanderthals laid their dead on beds of wildflowers, has been more or less taken apart by recent research, which suggests the pollen around the skeleton was more likely deposited by burrowing rodents. Scientists have a way of being ruthless with beautiful ideas, and this one may not have survived. But what remains, even without the flowers, is the burial itself, the intentional placement of the dead, the return to the same location across time, the care for the severely disabled. You can debate what exactly these things meant to the minds that did them. You cannot pretend they are the behavior of a creature incapable of grief. Here is the part that most people don't know yet, the part that was only confirmed in the last 15 years. And that rewrites the whole story from a direction nobody expected. Neanderthals are not gone. They are inside you. If your ancestry includes people from outside sub-Saharan Africa, if you are European, Asian, Middle Eastern, South American, Pacific Islander, between 1 and 4% of your DNA came from Neanderthals, not metaphorically, literally. Your ancestors, modern humans leaving Africa around 50,000 years ago, met Neanderthals in the Middle East and in Europe, and they had children together, multiple times. Across thousands of years, the two populations interbred, and those Neanderthal genes survived. They are still here because they were useful, because what Neanderthals had to offer was, in some cases, exactly what our ancestors needed. The most well-documented gift is immunity. Neanderthals had been living in European and Asian environments for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived. In that time, they had developed immune defenses against the specific bacteria, fungi, and parasites of those environments. Defenses coded into their genes, particularly in a family of receptors called toll-like receptors, TLR1, TLR6, and TLR10, which sit on the surface of cells and function as the body's first line of pathogen detection. When modern humans moved into Europe and encountered unfamiliar diseases in unfamiliar climates, the Neanderthal immune variants they had inherited gave them a survival advantage. Some estimates suggest that Neanderthal-derived versions of immune genes represent the majority of certain immune variants in non-African populations today. We walked into a continent full of pathogens we had never met, and we survived partly because we had already gotten the Neanderthal upgrade. Beyond immunity, Neanderthal DNA appears to have shaped hair color, skin tone, the ease with which a person's skin tans, bone density, lung capacity, metabolic rate, and even sleep patterns, and mood. Researchers analyzing nearly 300,000 people of non-African ancestry through the UK Biobank identified more than 4,000 Neanderthal genetic variants, still actively influencing 47 distinct human traits today. The person sitting next to you, their nose shape, how quickly they burn calories, how their body responds to cold, whether they are a morning person or a night person. Some fraction of all of that can be traced back to a population of humans we told ourselves were too stupid to matter. When modern humans arrived in Europe, Neanderthals disappeared. The exact mechanism is still debated. Outcompeted for resources, absorbed through interbreeding, killed by diseases we brought with us, pushed to the edges of their range by a more socially connected species with larger networks and faster cultural exchange. Probably some combination of all of these. What is almost certain is that Neanderthals did not simply lose a fair fight between equals. They were overwhelmed by a wave of population, not by the superior intelligence we have been crediting ourselves with for a century. The story we told was simpler. We were smarter, they were dumber, and the smarter ones won. That story let us feel like history is a meritocracy, like the things that exist today exist because they were better than the things that don't. But intelligence is not a single line with dumb at one end and smart at the other. A species that makes compound adhesives 200,000 years ago is not dumb. A species that makes rope and pigment crayons and shell jewelry and buries its dead and cares for its injured is not a lesser version of something. It is its own thing, with its own kind of competence, shaped by its own long history of surviving a world that tried constantly to kill it. We took their immune genes. We took their cold weather adaptations. Some researchers now believe we may have taken behavioral and technological knowledge directly from them. That the famous cultural explosion of modern humans in Europe, the sudden flowering of sophisticated tools and art and symbolic behavior around 40,000 years ago, may have been partly sparked by contact with Neanderthals, who had been doing versions of these things for far longer. Not students and teacher exactly. More like two groups who learned from each other in the way that people learn from contact, by watching, copying, adapting, and eventually blending. They survived an ice age. They ranged from Spain to Siberia. They made fire when they needed it, glue when they needed it, rope when they needed it, and jewelry when they wanted it. They looked after each other when injury would have meant death in any creature with less social commitment. They mourned their dead, or something that functioned enough like mourning that it brought people back to the same cave for thousands of years. And then they were gone, absorbed and overwhelmed and replaced, leaving behind only their bones and their tools, and a small, persistent thread of themselves woven into the genome of nearly every human being alive today. The next time someone calls you thick-skulled, take it as a compliment. Your skull is thicker because of them. You are still here, partly because they were here first. Everything in this video reflects the archaeological and genetic evidence as it stands in the mid-2020s, and it is worth being honest about something. This is a field in active upheaval. Interpretations that were settled 10 years ago are contested today. Dating methods that seemed reliable have been challenged. The flower burial, once a cornerstone of the compassionate Neanderthal argument, has been largely dismantled by new research suggesting burrowing rodents deposited the pollen, not grieving relatives. The The cave paintings attributed to Neanderthals in Spain have defenders and fierce critics. What makes this field genuinely interesting is that the revision has almost entirely gone in one direction. Every decade, Neanderthals get more sophisticated, not less. Every new discovery adds a layer, a tool, a pigment, a genetic variant that makes the old brutish image harder to defend. The science has not settled on exactly how smart Neanderthals were. It has settled, fairly decisively, on the fact that we were wrong about how dumb they were. And that is its own kind of answer. We built a story out of what we needed to believe. The evidence, slowly and patiently, has been correcting us ever since. What remains, regardless of which individual claim survives further scrutiny, is this: a species that endured for 400,000 years in Ice Age Europe, that made fire on demand, built composite tools with compound adhesives, twisted plant fibers into rope, painted cave walls, wore pigment on their skin, cared for their injured and their elderly, buried their dead, and wove enough of themselves into our genome that their biological legacy is still shaping our immune systems, our hair, our skin, and our sleep. That species deserves better than a hunched figure holding a club in a museum display case. They were not us, but they were not nothing. And we are, in the most literal sense possible, partly them